I still remember that Father's Day. The laughter, the expensive suits, the fake smiles. My son, my own flesh and blood, stood before me, a glass of champagne in his hand, surrounded by his rich friends. He looked at me with that smug grin that only the arrogant wear. Then he said it. "Dad, do you really like the $4,200 Camille gives you every month? Or do you just pretend it's enough?" Everyone laughed. My hands trembled, not from age, but from humiliation. I could feel my heart clenching, not from weakness, but from betrayal. I raised him alone after his mother died. I built his future brick by brick with these worn hands. And now he treated me like a beggar. The laughter echoed in my ears long after the guests left. I stared at the photo of him as a child, the boy who once held my finger and called me his hero. What happened to that boy? When did money turn him into a stranger? That night, I sat in the dark and whispered to myself, "You'll learn, son. You'll learn what $4,200 can't buy." Because this Father's Day would be the last time he ever mocked me, and the beginning of his lesson. My name is Harold, and I've lived most of my life with grease on my hands and hope in my heart. I was never rich, not with money, anyway, but I had something far more precious. Love, pride, and a son I thought was my whole world. After my wife, Martha, passed away when our boy was just 8, my life lost its color. But when I looked into his tear-filled eyes at her funeral, I made him a silent promise. "I'll give you everything I have, son, even if it means I have nothing left." And I kept that promise. Every morning, before the sun rose, I'd lace up my worn boots and head to the auto shop. The smell of oil and metal clung to me like a second skin. My co-workers used to joke that I cared more for engines than people, but they didn't know that every bolt I tightened, every tire I changed, was for him. There were nights I came home so tired I could barely stand, but I'd still make him dinner, his favorite, macaroni with too much cheese. We'd sit at the little kitchen table, him telling me stories about school, his eyes lighting up like stars when he said, "One day, I'll buy you a big house, Dad." Those words kept me going through every ache, every lonely winter. When he wanted to go to Harvard, I didn't hesitate. I sold my house, the only thing Martha and I had built together, and moved into a small rented room above the shop. I told everyone I was downsizing, but the truth was I was just sacrificing. I remember one Christmas in particular. The other workers went home to families, laughter echoing through the cold air. I sat alone in the workshop, welding a broken car door so I could earn enough for his new laptop. That Christmas morning, when he opened it, he hugged me and said, "You're the best dad in the world." I believed him. I really did. Even after he grew distant, the calls less frequent, the visits shorter, I told myself it was just life, success keeping him busy. I kept his room the same, his trophies on the shelf, his graduation photo on the wall. Sometimes I'd sit there in the quiet, pretending he'd walk through the door any minute and say, "Hey, old man," but he never did. Still, I never complained. Fathers don't expect gratitude. We just hope for respect. I didn't need luxury or recognition. All I wanted was to be remembered as the man who never stopped loving his son, even when the world forgot about me. That's why his betrayal cut so deep. Because it didn't come from a stranger's cruelty, but from the very child I once carried on my shoulders, believing he'd never let me fall. I remember the morning like a wound that never quite healed. A bright, polite day that hid its teeth. I'd received fewer phone calls from him over the months. Small talk, then silence. I told myself success made him busy. So when his invitation arrived for Father's Day brunch, my heart did a foolish little dance. Maybe, just maybe, he'd remembered. I ironed the only jacket I owned that still fit, smoothed my hands, and drove to his house. With a cake I'd baked myself, the driveway smelled of new leather and gasoline from the cars that never used to be ours. I stepped inside to laughter that felt like a room full of knives. They clustered around cocktail tables, smiling in practiced ways I'd seen in business magazines. My son came forward, handsome, polished, kissed my cheek like a man greeting an acquaintance. "Dad, so good to see you," he said, but his eyes flicked past me to see how the room reacted. That flicker, the calculation, stung more than any insult. They seated me at the end of the long table, far from the center where deals were whispered. Camille slid into her chair like she'd practiced the movement in a mirror. She tapped her phone and smiled at me as if reading a script. "Harold, darling, we've arranged to send you $4,200 every month. Isn't that lovely?" she cooed, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room laughed, polite chuckles that sharpened into real amusement. I remember my fork stopping in the air. The cake I brought tasted like cardboard. Later, when the wine loosened tongues, his friend Mark joked, "He's practically on a retainer now, huh? Full pension for the old man." My son laughed. Not the proud laugh of a boy who'd once been helped out of a tree, but the easy, superior laugh of someone who never feared consequence. I felt the blood drain from my face. Shock came first, a cold, surreal bubble that made everything seem distant. How could they say that? I thought. How could he? After the guests left, Camille handed me an envelope. A neat, impersonal envelope with a bank card peeking out. "It's for you, Harold. It'll cover everything," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I took it without looking, my hands shaking. Inside was a card and a printed schedule of transfers. $40,200, monthly. Like charity, a child inside me, the one who used to believe in simple kindness, wanted to cry with relief. But the man who raised that child felt only humiliation. I drove home in a fog. At first the anger was too sharp to name. I looped through denial like a car stuck in a rut. Maybe they were joking. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. That night I sat in the dark, replayed their faces. I felt small in a way I hadn't since my knees stopped working properly. Days later, the calls dwindled to nothing. I'd wait by the phone, rehearse a voice that sounded unbothered, then hang up and weep quietly. Sadness settled in like dust. I began to notice things I'd never let myself see before. How his emails said "Dad" with a comma, and then a CC to Camille. How he took too long to reply to my photos. Disbelief followed the sadness. I kept looking for the boy under the businessman's suit. The boy who'd once cheered when I returned from night shift with a snaggle-toothed grin. I found only photographs. Glossy, staged, smiling at cameras, never at me. Even his birthday messages grew shorter, thinner, as if printed from a template. I'd been a father who sold a house, who mended suitcases for travel, who washed coats and ironed shirts. And now I was a footnote in his calendar. How did I earn this? I'd whisper into my pillow, and the only reply was the house settling, indifferent. Anger came last, slow as rust. It began as a hot flare. I wanted to smash the television, to throw the card against the wall. Then it cooled into something steadier, a clear, bright anger that polished my memory into weapons. I remembered every sacrifice, every night shift, every empty Christmas. The mortgage paid off early so he could have his future. And a terrible clarity filled me. This wasn't just disrespect, it was betrayal. They had packaged my dignity and offered it back as alms. I found myself replaying the conversation where my son called me the poor hero in front of his friends, the way they'd titter like schoolchildren at a whispered secret. "He likes the attention," Camille had said once. "He performs his poverty for sympathy." Those words landed like stones. I felt disbelief twist into disgust, then into a hunger for something more than explanations. I began to simmer with a patient, terrifying need, not merely to be vindicated, but to make him understand the human cost of his mockery. By the time I uncovered the small, cold details, the way signatures had been brushed aside, the ways I'd been reduced to an account number in someone's ledger, the anger was a steady drumbeat. It wasn't the rage of a man who wanted to ruin. It was the righteous fury of one who had been used and discarded. My heart had been broken open, and from that fissure, something else grew. A promise, not shouted, but whispered, that he would feel the truth of what he had done. I slept poorly after that, not because of sorrow alone, but because the idea of standing up, of answering back, would not let me rest. I remember the day like a bell tolling in an empty church, a sound that makes everything else stop. It began with a plain envelope from the bank, the kind you don't expect to change a life. My hands shook as I slit it open, not from age but from a sudden, cold dread. Inside were pages I'd never thought to look for, loan papers, guarantor forms, signatures that looked like my name. At first, my mind refused to match the letters to the truth. Maybe it was a clerical error, I told myself. Maybe they'd made a mistake. I read the lines again and again until the black ink blurred. Each repetition made the cold travel deeper. Somewhere between the third and fifth read, denial packed its bags and left. There it was. My name. In my handwriting, or so it seemed, tied to millions I had never seen, to debts I never signed for. I pressed the paper to my chest like a foolish talisman, hoping warmth would change the words. It didn't. Grief rose up first, a heavy, choking thing, not just for what they'd done to me, but for the boy who had become capable of it. Images came flooding back. His first wobbling bike, the way he cried when he scraped his knee, the night I sold our home so he could go to that college. How could the same hands that once clutched mine be used to bind me with legal chains? I felt betrayed in a way that hollowed me out. It was like being thrown out of my own life and watching strangers move into my rooms. Tears pooled, and I let them come, not as weakness, but as a cleansing. I cried for the boy I raised and the man he'd chosen to be. Anger arrived like a tide, not sudden, but inevitable. It washed away the last of my indecision. I paced the small kitchen, the clock ticking too loud, each second a little drumbeat of urgency. "You sold your house for him, Harold," I told myself aloud, because saying it made it real. "You fixed engines in the cold, skipped meals, and worked every holiday so he could have chances you never did." The list of sacrifices unfurled until my chest ached, and with each remembered hardship, my anger sharpened from a dull ache to a blade. I thought of Camille's smile as she slid that envelope across the table, of the way the guests laughed like wolves. I went to his room, still exactly as I'd left it years ago, and the sight of his old school books felt like salt in a wound. There was a small photograph tucked in a corner, his hand on my cheek, his grin full of trust. I held it, and it burned in my palm like a hot coal. Grief became resolve in that instant. I wasn't crying for pity anymore. I was gathering a kind of furious strength. What stopped me from yelling was not my temper, but my calculation. Fury without plan is only noise. So I sat down at the kitchen table and made a decision hard as iron. I would not be humiliated into silence. I would not let those signatures and envelopes become the story people remembered about me. If he used my name as a shield, then my name would be the sword. If he sold his soul for suitcases of cash, I would show him the cost, my inner voice, tired and seasoned by decades of toil, whispered instructions, remember facts, keep receipts, find witnesses, memories sharpened into proof. Small details I had chalked up to forgetfulness now hinted at patterns. I thought of the nights I'd sat awake, thinking of justice as something far away. Tonight, justice felt close enough to touch. This was not a childish desire for revenge. It was a man reclaiming what had been taken with quiet, relentless clarity. I stood up, folded the papers neatly, and placed them in the wooden box where I kept every scrap of our life. Contracts, report cards, the grocery lists he'd once scribbled. My hands were steady now. The trembling was gone, replaced by a cold focus I hadn't felt since I'd tightened the last bolt on an engine at midnight. Enough, I said to the empty room, and the word felt like a verdict I passed on my own patience. No more waiting. No more pretending the distance between us was only the fault of time. I dressed slowly, old joints protesting, but my movements sure, as if muscles remembered an urgency they'd not used in years. Before I left, I took one last look at the house that had sheltered us both. The faded curtains, the dented mailbox, and promised it something simple. Dignity. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would stand and make him answer for what he'd done. Walking out the door, I felt the past tighten into a weapon in my hands, and for the first time since Martha died, I felt truly dangerous. On the street, the air tasted like rain and possibility, and a small, fierce peace settled over me. I folded my resolve into a single clean thought. I will make him see. Not destroy him for the sake of ruin, but teach him the price of what he'd paid for comfort, and the cost of trading love for status. I did not know yet how it would end, only that it would end differently from the slow, quiet erasure he had planned for me. So I swore to myself, quiet and absolute. No more will I sit in the dark and let his laughter be the last sound in the room. Enough was finally enough. I would take back my name, my dignity, and in doing so, I would force him to confront the man he'd betrayed. And as the vow left my lips, steady and cold, I knew the reckoning had begun. I moved like a man who had spent a lifetime fixing things nobody else wanted to touch. Quietly, carefully, and with the stubborn patience of old hands. First, I did what any sensible man would do. I stopped reacting. I stopped answering his calls, stopped sending the polite replies that masked my hurt. Silence, I decided, would be my first weapon. Then I made a list, not of people to hurt, but of facts to prove. Dates, signatures, bank transfers, the months when gifts turned into patterns. Each line on that page was a breadcrumb toward the truth. I dug through drawers and boxes I hadn't opened in years, receipts, sealed letters, the photocopy of the mortgage papers I'd thought I lost. Memory became a ledger. Memory became evidence. Next, I went to Samuel, the lawyer who owed me more than he would admit. He didn't blink when I told him the story. Instead, he folded his hands and asked me for records. "We'll make them answer," he said, like a man closing a casebook. We didn't rush. The law moves slower than a man's anger, but it moves with a steady hand. Samuel taught me how to let doubt creep into their world without shouting it from a rooftop. I recorded nothing illegal. No breaking of locks, no theft. I simply asked for copies, filed requests, and preserved every scrap that proved what I knew in my bones. Paper trails are killers in suits. Meanwhile, Samuel used a contact at a small investigative firm. A young woman named Aisha, who loved puzzles and hated liars. She traced transfers, matched handwriting, and pointed out the places where the story didn't line up. I began to write letters, carefully worded, to the board members of his company. Nothing accusatory, just questions that look innocent until you see how they pile up. Can you confirm this transfer? Who signed this? Simple nudges that made executives uncomfortable. I reached out in secret to someone who had once worked in their accounting department. An old acquaintance who still resented being dismissed. He gave me names, dates, and the soft whistleblower details you can't find in public filings. Patience became ritual. I visited the cafe across from his office and sat with my coffee, watching people who didn't recognize me walk by thinking they owned the world. I learned their rhythms, their hours, when investors were in town, when board members flew in. Timing matters. At night, I read up on corporate law and Samuel's battered books, circling passages with a pencil. I learned the language of audits and fiduciary duty until it felt like a second dialect. Knowledge was another ally. I planted rumors gently. Nothing false, just questions spoken to the right ears. A financial journalist who dislikes vanity. A former partner with a grudge. Rumors that are true are seeds that sprout fast. I cultivated witnesses. Small favors returned. Loyalty repaid with kindness. People respond to respect. I gave them time and listened. In exchange, they gave me fragments of the truth. I made sure every step could be documented. A recorded call here where he admitted something careless, an email he sent in anger that could be pulled into evidence, a bank statement that refused to lie. When I met with Samuel, we would place the new piece of evidence on the table and let it sit there like a sleeping animal. We didn't pounce, we prepared. Each new piece made the pattern clearer. I rehearsed nothing. I simply kept my face calm and my intentions colder. I answered when asked, "Are you sure?" with a steady, "Yes." Certainty unnerves the guilty. Some nights, I walked past their neighborhood and watched the lights in their windows. I wondered if Camille ever felt the hollow where empathy should be. I wondered if my son ever woke alone and felt the echo of his choices. I refused to make the plan a spectacle. Revenge, I decided, would be surgical. It would cut through facades and leave the truth bleeding out where everyone could see it. There were choices to make about exposure, public or private, legal or reputational. We weighed them like men deciding how to remove a tumor without killing the patient. I wanted him alive enough to understand what his hands had done. Samuel suggested a quiet letter to the primary investor. Aisha suggested an anonymous tip to the financial columnist who loved scandals. Both moves had risk, and both promised different kinds of ruin. I liked the options. I practiced patience the way other men practice prayer. I let their arrogance grow. Cockiness makes mistakes. I let Camille grow complacent. Complacency breeds a certain careless language. Sometimes I surprised myself with how calm I felt. My grief had been burned away, and, in its place, a professional sort of fury took root. One that knew how to wait for the exact right moment. I kept my allies close, and my plans cloaked. Only Samuel and Aisha knew everything. A handful of others knew just enough to be useful. Secrets are safer in rooms with fewer doors. When a new tidbit came in, a ledger entry that didn't match, a ledger signed in a hurried hand, my stomach clenched like it does before a key turn. We cataloged it, time-stamped it, and stored it. Every strategy I adopted had one rule: stay legal, stay moral in method, expose only what the truth supports. I refused to become the very kind of man who trades dignity for satisfaction. The plan was not a single blow, but a series of small, unavoidable pressures that would make their life leak credibility and comfort. We weren't out for blood. We were out for accountability. Still, I kept one card to myself. A move I would reveal only when the others had done their work, and the house of cards finally trembled. I would not show my hand before the moment demanded it. What I can tell you is this: patience, proof, and a few unexpected friends can topple a golden throne. What I won't tell you, not yet, is the very last thing I set in motion. And as I folded the newest papers into the wooden box and closed the lid, I felt the strange, steady heartbeat of a plan that was finally ready to breathe. Tomorrow, when the right phone call is made or the right envelope opens, the world will turn, and the son who mocked my $4,200 will see the cost of his cruelty. I picked up the first phone call like a surgeon picking up a scalpel. Calm, deliberate, and with hands that knew exactly where to cut. Samuel had already placed the paperwork in the hands of a quiet investigative journalist who loved a good unraveling. Not loud tabloids, but the kind of reporter who kills reputations with facts. The first article dropped on a Tuesday morning, a careful piece that asked questions, showed documents, and quoted an anonymous former accountant who smelled something rotten. I watched my son on the news feed, the color draining from his face as anchors read the handwriting, comparisons, and bank transfers out loud. He called me, frantic, voice high with panic. I didn't pick up. That silence was part of the pressure. Next, Aisha delivered the handwriting analysis. It was clinical, merciless. The signature on the guarantor form didn't match the genuine samples. The lab report used words like forgery and inconsistent. Within 48 hours, the board called an emergency meeting. Investors demanded answers. Men who once toasted my son's brilliance now spoke in short, cold sentences. Money is allergic to risk and to shame. He tried to mend it the old way. Charm and cash. He made offers, threats thinly veiled as negotiations, and even reached out to Samuel to settle privately. Samuel smiled and told him the law didn't care for charm. Camille, sensing the ship was sinking, started making mistakes. She overshared at a charity gala, calling donors by pet names, and slipping a comment about keeping the old man quiet. That careless voice became a clip that a reporter played back in an audio file. Then came the twist I had been waiting for. An accounting whistleblower, the quiet woman from his company who'd been ignored, sent us a folder. It contained an internal memo showing that company funds had been redirected into private accounts tied to projects that only existed on paper. My son's defenses began to leak. He called friends, begged partners, offered to sign over assets, but each move only documented his panic, and our case quietly grew stronger. He hired expensive lawyers who tried to bury things in legalese, but their motions only unearthed more evidence. Lawyers make mistakes when they believe money can silence paper. At a shareholder meeting, under oath, his voice trembled as questions turned to accusations. Investors who once flew first class to his launches now filed to remove him. The board suspended him pending an independent audit. Camille, who had stood beside him in the light, found herself alone. A recorded voicemail, one she'd left for a friend boasting about how easy it was to manage Harold's expectations, circulated and became the second headline. Her social calendars emptied. Sponsors backed away. My son tried a desperate move. A public video apology, hands shaking, eyes wet. He promised change, claimed ignorance, pleaded for privacy. But people had already seen the documents. Apologies are thin cloth against paper cuts. The criminal investigation followed like a shadow. Forgery and fraud are not just business sins. They are crimes. The police came with folded notebooks and a polite professional gravity. Evidence is a patient hunter. At his arraignment, he stood in front of a judge and for the first time met the cold weight of accountability. The courtroom was full of faces that had once applauded him. Now they watched, solemn and silent. Camille's lawyers tried to negotiate a hush settlement, but the public pressure and the clarity of the documents made privacy impossible. She lost contracts, endorsements, even the comfortable invitations to the city's best events. Reputation, once a fortress, crumbled. But I wanted something more than the spectacle of downfall. I wanted restitution, that made his deeds visible in a way he couldn't ignore. So Samuel and I pushed for a civil suit that would create a ledger of truth, binding, undeniable, published in legal record. The judge ordered a forensic audit. The audit traced funds, showed the fake projects, and mapped how my name had been used as a buffer. It was a map of betrayal, printed in black and white, impossible to ignore. When the verdict came in civil court, it was precise. My son was ordered to pay damages, his control of the company revoked, and a public notice of wrongdoing placed in the business papers he had once owned. The legal loss came with humiliation stitched neatly into the margins. There was a final twist that tasted bittersweet. One of his closest partners, a man I had once fixed a radiator for, quietly turned witness for the prosecution. He had been burned too, and his testimony toppled the last of the smokescreens. Friends do not always stay loyal when the ledgers are opened. In the weeks that followed, the life they'd built on top of other people began to settle into ruin. Offices emptied, boardrooms reconfigured, Camille's memberships revoked. The chest of status they'd paraded was empty in the cold light of truth. My son's phone no longer filled with dinner invitations. He moved to a smaller apartment. The cars were sold to pay settlements. People called him by his first name in a softer tone, as if he had shrunk to size. I did not dance on the ruins. When he came to my door later, trembling and contrite, I met him with the slow, controlled calm of a man who had waited with purpose. He fell to his knees and begged, and for a long time I simply watched him. A boy I did not recognize. His apology was raw and small. He offered to sign papers, to do community service, to spend years in therapy. I accepted a fraction of what the court gave me, and I used it with care. Donated to the shelter his company had pretended to fund, paid pensions overdue to longtime employees, and set up a scholarship in my wife's name for students with no money but with grit. That final move was a lesson carved into the world. His money bought status, but it could not erase the harm. I made sure the people he'd hurt received a measure of justice paid from the chest he had once opened without thought. The punishment was complete, not because I wanted to watch him burn, but because the truth had been brought into the light, and he was forced, at last, to face the wreckage he'd made. He lost more than assets. He lost the comfortable ignorance that had allowed him to treat people as ledger entries. He lost the crowd who applauded at the expense of empathy. And though the law had taken its course, the real punishment, the quiet shame, the nights spent staring at empty rooms, the absence of easy laughter, was something no money could fix. When the storm settled, I sat with the knowledge that justice had been served in both public and private ways. The man who had mocked my $200 now measured his days in lessons and regret. I had not become vengeful for sport. I had become a mirror, a reflection he could not avoid. He could rebuild, perhaps, but he would always carry the scar of what he did. As for me, I kept my dignity intact, used my victory to help others, and learned that sometimes the quiet, patient unfolding of truth is the most devastating revenge of all. ChatGPT said, when the dust finally settled, I found myself sitting on the same porch where I had once dreamed of a peaceful old age surrounded by laughter and love. The air was quiet now, not empty, but calm. The revenge was done, justice was served, and yet my heart felt heavier than I expected. I had spent months crafting every detail of my plan, every piece of evidence, every careful strike. Watching it unfold had been both satisfying and painful. Like cauterizing a wound. The infection was gone, but the scar would never fade. My son, my own flesh and blood, had faced the consequences of his actions. The world saw him for what he had done. He had been stripped of his empire, his luxury, his arrogance. Yet when I looked at him that final day, standing outside my door with trembling hands, I didn't see the millionaire anymore. I saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders to school. The boy who used to say, "Dad, I'll make you proud one day." He asked for forgiveness, not with words, but with his silence. His eyes said everything. Shame, regret, maybe even love buried under years of greed. I didn't speak much. I only told him, "Forgiveness isn't a gift, son. It's something you earn by living differently." He nodded, tears cutting through the dust on his face. In the weeks that followed, I lived quietly. The papers stopped calling. The gossip faded. The people who once whispered about the old man who got betrayed began to greet me with respect again. Not because I had destroyed my son, but because I had done it with dignity, without lowering myself to cruelty. Sometimes I walk past the old factory district where I once worked double shifts. I think of the years I spent feeding dreams that weren't mine, saving pennies so my boy could go to college. I don't regret those sacrifices. They were pure. What poisoned them was not the giving, but his forgetting. Still, I found a new purpose. I used part of the restitution money to open a community workshop, a place where retired men could fix, build, and share stories. I named it the Father's Table. Every Sunday I serve tea there, and young people come to listen. I tell them this story, not to teach revenge, but to teach respect. I tell them that wealth without humility is a burden, not a blessing. That the measure of a man isn't in his bank account, but in how he treats those who built the path beneath his feet. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from my son. No excuses, no justifications, just an honest note that read, "Dad, I finally understand what you meant by real worth. I'm working at a shelter now, rebuilding from scratch. Thank you for teaching me, even when it hurt." I sat there for a long time, staring at those words. A part of me wept, not from sorrow, but from release. Perhaps redemption had begun, not for him alone, but for both of us. Now, when Father's Day comes, I don't wait for gifts. I visit my wife's grave, lay fresh lilies, and whisper, "We did it right, Mary." We didn't raise a monster, just a lost man who found his way too late. Then I sit on that porch again, watching the sun dip low, its light soft and golden, the kind of light that forgives even the darkest corners. And if I could leave one truth behind for anyone listening, it would be this: revenge can make the world see their sin, but forgiveness, when earned, makes you see your peace. Because sometimes the real victory isn't in destroying what hurt you. It's in reclaiming the part of yourself that refused to die because of it.